Welcome back to my channel. I'm continuing to talk today about non-biblical literature and the compositional device views that I disagree with. The material I'm doing in this short series is found in The Mirror or the Mask, so if you want more details on this, please get a hold of a copy of The Mirror or the Mask. But I'm trying to make the material available in multiple formats. Something that I sometimes say to people, and it's meant to get their attention, but I also mean it. I mean it literally, is that I do not agree that the genre that Dr. Licona attributes to the Gospels existed at the time that the Gospels were written. Now, you may say, but there were Greco-Roman biographies like Plutarch's Lives, so what do you mean the genre didn't exist? That is to say, as it's defined, and as Dr. Licona defines it, he says that it was part and parcel, he uses that exact phrase, part and parcel, of the genre to use these fact-changing compositional devices. And he even says that we should be surprised if we did not find these devices. So in other words, he's treating it as probable, highly probable, if some document is in that genre, that we would find these devices because they're part and parcel, supposedly, of the genre. So when you define the genre in that way, that it was part and parcel of it, that they would be expected to use these fact-changing devices, then I deny that that existed. Now, even if it had existed, it doesn't follow that the gospel authors were writing in it. After all, we have both movies based on true events and documentaries, literal documentaries, in our own time. So just to say that the genre of movies based on true events exists doesn't tell you whether some given item is in that genre or not. Okay, so the argument about the Gospels that they are changing facts like this fails at multiple points. But one point at which it fails, I contend, arises from the mishandling of non-biblical literature. And I've been going over that in these last few weeks, the mishandling of non-biblical history. In the flowchart that I use in The Mirror or the Mask, one of the nodes, and I think in some ways the hardest node for the compositional device theorist to get past, is the question, was this propaganda or deception? Was this intended to mislead the readers? Because if it is propaganda or deception, then it's not a compositional device in the relevant sense that we're being told these were just accepted compositional devices. And this is why I've titled this video, and I'll have a similar title next time, Deceptions Are Not Devices. By definition, the point of attributing this type of compositional device to one of the gospel authors is supposed to be that it clears the gospel author of the charge of deception. No, just like when somebody makes a movie based on true events, it doesn't make him a liar. Or, if you just understand what genre it's in, then you go in and the parents whisper to the kids. If the kid says, did that really happen? Well, it's just a movie, honey. And, so they change some things. And so then nobody's being deceived, even if they don't know where they changed the things. So it's still not reliable, as I often point out. Still, it's not a lie. So why am I saying this? Because it's surprising that occasionally you will see someone who's arguing that the Gospels are written in this type of genre where they were just allowed to make changes and no, it wasn't a deception, bring up as an example, supposedly in support of the existence of these types of devices, where that example is obviously a deception. So how can that example possibly support the existence of non-deceptive devices? And I'll be giving a really striking example of that today. I've noticed something a little interesting. It seems to me that Christian scholars who embrace this kind of compositional device view are more strongly motivated than classicists to absolutely insist that it is not deceptive. In a way, I think classicists are a little bit more cynical, and so non-Christian classicists, I should say, because, if they attribute fact-changing to an ancient author, they're not necessarily, insisting that no one was deceived. They're just saying that the authors, in a sense, thought of themselves as the elite and therefore thought it was okay for them to deceive, much like journalists in our own day. Now, I'm not saying that's true of all secular classicists. I'm not sure that's true of Christopher Pelling. But I actually came across something when I was writing my book, The Mirror or the Mask, and it was a quotation from a classicist named Mellor, Mellor, and Dr. Licona cites Mellor from this immediate context when Mellor claims that Tacitus changed a particular date of a trial, and I have a whole analysis of that in The Mirror or the Mask. In fact, it seems that later Mellor himself actually changed his mind about that and concluded that Tacitus didn't change that date. You have to compare two different things that he wrote. But for my purposes in this video, the more interesting point is that Mellor leads into his discussion when he thought Tacitus did change that date of the trial by saying this, quote, "In modern times, writers and politicians often deceive through statistics, lies, damn lies, and statistics, while the ancient writer used instead his rhetorical training." And then immediately Mellor goes on to say that Tacitus changed this date, and then says that, hey, that wouldn't have mattered. Tacitus wouldn't have thought that mattered because he was trying to teach a moral lesson. And it's amusing because Mellor doesn't even suggest any moral lesson that Tacitus was trying to teach. Like, what moral lesson? What moral lesson are you even talking about, Dr. Mellor? And when you read the boring passage of Tacitus, it's this really, indirect dating that you have to say, oh, okay, this other event happened, so that would seem to put it in the spring. And I mean, Tacitus doesn't say anything about it being spring or draw any moral lesson from that. So it's a really lazy thing for Mellor to say. But Dr. Licona quotes part of that paragraph, but he doesn't quote the part about writers and politicians often deceive through statistics while the ancient writer used instead his rhetorical training. So, Mellor doesn't really care if Tacitus was deceiving people. And that's kind of important because, after all, no Christian wants to attribute deception to the gospel authors. And that's something that Dr. Licona, Dr. Craig Evans, to some extent Craig Keener, who endorse these compositional devices, hang on to. No, of course not. This isn't deception. You just need to understand the ancient standards, and then you'll know it was a compositional device instead. And that's important, right? Because obviously it can't be, or at least I think it's obvious. There are actually other biblical scholars who sometimes say that God thought it was okay for his authors to deceive, but not this group. I have my disagreements with them, but they don't think that, or are not saying that God thought it was okay for the gospel authors to deceive. So they're really insisting on that and contrasting that. So, that being the case, they absolutely must not use an instance of what they themselves recognize as deception, and what is obviously deception in its own context, to be an accepted device. And the whole point of an accepted device is that it's not deceptive. Now, that brings me to the example I'm going to give today. Now, the example I'm going to give today concerns Lucian. Lucian was a historian and satirist. He lived in the 100s AD, so the 2nd century after Christ. And he wrote a work on history and the standards for history, and in that he holds up very high standards, actually, with the exception that he endorses making up speeches. But other than that, he's like super insistent on the historians, high standards. But in his personal life, in his private life, not qua his professional historian, he doesn't always hold up such standards. And I'm going to be explaining that example here soon. Now, here's where this example comes up. Back in around 2010, 2011 might have been the publication date, but I usually think of it as a 2010 book. Dr. Licona published a big book on the resurrection, and this is when he first started publicly introducing this idea of these compositional devices. One of the most controversial things he said in there, along with other controversial things in that book that have sometimes been forgotten, was that the raising of the saints that Matthew describes right after Jesus' crucifixion didn't really happen. That it was supposedly a compositional device, and he calls it special effects. And he goes to great lengths in that book to argue that there was this accepted, existing thing of apocalyptic language in the ancient world that people wouldn't take seriously. Now, in my book, The Mirror of the Mask, I don't write a whole lot about that raising of the saints passage for a couple of reasons. One of them is because so much ink was spilled on that, even before I began looking into this, that I encountered a sort of fatigue for that topic. And when I would start disagreeing with Dr. Licona's views, people would go, oh, yeah, that's all about that one passage about the raising of the saints. And, I felt as though I had trouble getting people's attention because they literally were under the impression that it was just about this one passage and this apocalyptic language that supposedly everybody recognized and so forth. And I wanted to avoid that. I wanted to say, no, it's so much more. And these are supposedly not even immediately recognizable to the people of their own time. So let's, instead of talking about the raising of the saints passage, let's talk about, John making up I thirst, or other things like that, supposedly a doublet where Matthew might have made up a second healing of the blind and so forth. These things, to get a better view of the range of what these things really are and not just focus on that one. So I wrote a blog post, a long blog post where I go through all of the examples that, or types of examples at least, that Dr. Licona brought up on those pages in his resurrection book, and I kind of punt to that in The Mirror or the Mask, and I'll link to that blog post here. Within the span of several pages, Dr. Licona chunks in what you might call everything in the kitchen sink. It's really ironic because this is all supposed to be about genre, but he throws in, things that are completely poetry. I mean, it's not just one little bit of what is otherwise a historical narrative, as in the case of Matthew, which he claims is poetry, but, a psalm, right, that is entirely poetical. It's not a historical narrative at all, or a work by Virgil that doesn't present itself as historical at all, and so forth. And it all just kind of gets thrown in, along with apocalyptic things that Josephus narrates, which I think Josephus may actually have believed, by the way. So in this blog post, I kind of take these different types, and I say, well, this is obviously not even close to being Matthew's genre, as Dr. Licona seems to recognize, and at least in large part, Matthew is writing historical narrative. It's just in these few places where, Dr. Licona thinks it's not. So, why are we comparing it to one of Virgil's eclogues, okay? And then in other places, I say, well, why are you so sure that, this ancient historian didn't himself believe it? That doesn't mean we have to believe that, a lamb spoke in the temple or whatever. That doesn't mean he doesn't believe it. So I go through all these different types. And one of them I hit is this problem with Lucian. So here's what you have to realize. This example from Lucian is one of many that Dr. Licona is using to argue for the existence of a sort of accepted device of apocalyptic language surrounding someone's death. And he lists, he doesn't say a whole lot about it. He just quotes a bit of it on those pages and says it's also of interest. But it's supposed to be also of interest because it's part of this whole thing that is supposed to defend this conclusion that it's merely special effects in Matthew. So that's your context there. So what's going on with Lucian? Well, there was a cynic who for a while became a Christian and then ceased to be a Christian and so forth, named Peregrinus. And he burned himself to death. And Lucian just had nothing but scorn for him. He believed that he was kind of crazy and wanted fame, a kind of very perverse kind of fame. And he even makes fun of Peregrinus. I was just rereading this today, and I had either forgotten about this or I hadn't read this bit of it before, where he talks about Peregrinus constantly putting off burning himself to death. And, like he doesn't really want to do this. He just wants people to, think highly of him or whatever in this really twisted way. So he's got all this contempt. And then after, Peregrinus, who was called himself Proteus, I believe. Yeah, Proteus. He took on that name as like a nickname. After he was dead, Lucian kind of trolled some people. So we got to remember Lucian was a satirist. A satirist has a lot of contempt for his fellow man and for the foibles of human nature. And as I put it in the blog post, when he wasn't giving serious advice about writing history, Lucian was evidently not above hoaxing people in daily life, but privately making fun of people you think are stupid by seeing what tall tales they will swallow is not confined to the ancient world and is not a literary device. The technical term for it is being a jerk. Okay, so that's what Lucian did. So I'm going to read the passage. He wrote a letter, so it's not some kind of work called The Death of Peregrinus. I mean, that's what people call it, but it was a private letter that he wrote to a friend where he's going on and on about how stupid this guy was who burned himself to death and how stupid people were for admiring him. I assure you, my friend, I had no end of trouble telling the story to all while they asked questions and sought exact information. Whenever I noticed a man of taste, I would tell him the facts without embellishment, as I have to you. But for the benefit of the dullards agog to listen, I would thicken the plot a bit on my own account, saying that when the pyre was kindled and Proteus flung himself bodily in, a great earthquake first took place, accompanied by a bellowing of the ground, and then a vulture, flying up out of the midst of the flames, went off to heaven, saying in human speech with a loud voice, I am through with the earth, to Olympus I fare. They were wonderstruck, and blessed themselves with a shudder, and asked me whether the vulture sped eastward or westward. I made them whatever reply occurred to me. So he's making fun of these people because he was able to lie to them. What is rather astounding is that Licona seems to think that an incident in which Lucian brags about taking in some credulous listeners helps to support the theory of a convention of understood apocalyptic language in the ancient world, when it supports exactly the opposite. Okay, the fact that people believed him makes it plausible that when people told this kind of, like, wow, these amazing things happened, there were people who would believe them. Not that it was so widely understood to be made up that everybody knew that if you talked about an earthquake at someone's death, you were just making it up. Okay, I mean, it's just the opposite, because when Lucian tells these guys about an earthquake at Peregrinus' death, which he made up, they didn't know he was making it up. They thought it was real, and then he laughs at them for that. It might seem like we shouldn't have to emphasize this statement. Deceptions are not devices, but the occurrence of this passage from Lucian as being of interest in these pages of Dr. Licona's book. I believe it's page 549. If I check it again, 548 to 549, I'll put the exact page number into the show notes. shows that apparently it doesn't go without saying. Apparently we actually have to say it. Don't bring up a case of blatant deception as an incident that's supposed to be part of a cumulative case supporting the existence of a compositional device that everybody understood wasn't real. And then say, see, the gospel authors weren't deceptive because they were using compositional devices. That doesn't work argumentatively, and that should be obvious, but unfortunately it apparently isn't. So I'm saying this again because this idea of these compositional devices of all these different kinds, right? Like making up earthquakes, in apparently historical narratives like Matthew, but that everybody understood didn't really happen. Or, changing the time when things happen, or transferring something from one person's mouth to another person's mouth when you knew, and making it that he said it personally when you knew that he didn't really. And so I deny that these existed as compositional devices that were just expected in a genre, and therefore I deny that a genre of which such devices were part and parcel existed. That's a kind of a nail in the coffin for that view of the Gospels. And if the people who are urging that view of the Gospels are misunderstanding secular literature, how much the more are they misunderstanding the Gospels? Next time I'm going to talk about another instance of deception, this time on the part of Josephus. And I'm not going to be disagreeing quite as sharply with the author I'm going to be citing next time. I'm not really as critical of the article that author wrote, but nonetheless, I don't think that the question should even have been raised whether what Josephus did might lie or might not lie, does it or does it not lie, within the conventions of Greco-Roman bioi, because the author himself, quite rightly, I think, recognizes that Josephus was trying to be deceptive. And so that, automatically, by definition, should mean it doesn't fall within these, understood conventions of a genre, because then that would mean it wouldn't be deceptive. Those two are incompatible. So I want to give that because I really want to drive home this final node of the flow chart. That if you're using this inductive method where you find a discrepancy and then you decide that it's a real discrepancy and you decide that the person really did it deliberately, okay, you've still got to cross that hurdle. Well, maybe he was just trying to mislead his readers. And a lot of times the reasons that we can give, he's trying to draw a moral, or in the case of Josephus, he's trying to get the emperor off his back, or whatever, he's trying to, help people to see a theological truth or whatever. Might that not be something that he has to deceive in order to bring about? And I would argue that would be the case for Josephus. So more details on that next time around. Please like and subscribe. Please recommend this channel to others. Please check out the podcast if you want to just listen to the audio. Remember, it's the November and following second Lydia McGrew podcast link. And please come back next time to the Lydia McGrew channel where we're making common sense rigorous.